Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm continuing my series for A-level history about the history of the Soviet Union. So I'll pick up where I left off, the late 1920s. So by 1928, Stalin was clearly in the saddle. Remember, he was first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. A mouthful, I know, but everyone knew he was the supremo. There is a book by Simon Sebag Montefiore called The Red Tsar, published in 2006, which argues that he wasn't firmly in control till the early 1930s. That's against the historical consensus. Stalin was going to begin the purges. He'd already rooted out ideological dissidents in the early 1920s, the anti-party group, as he called them, in Leningrad. Purges in the 20s, if people weren't actually trying to overthrow the state, consisted of self-criticism in public, demotion, expulsion of the party, occasionally imprisonment, gulag, remember that slave labor camp. It was rarely death, but that was going to change. Stalin's paramountcy was ensured by the secret police, and a cult of the personality started around him. Remember, there'd been one for Lenin. It was more posthumous than during his lifetime, and Stalin tried to link himself to Lenin as much as possible, to exaggerate his role in the October Revolution, to hide the fact that Stalin voted against the October Revolution, feeling the time was not ripe and the Bolsheviks would inherit an impossible situation, even if their efforts were crowned with success. So the secret police had been created under Lenin. They underwent many changes under Stalin. Remember, the secret police originally called Cheka, well, that was the acronym for the Extraordinary All-Russian Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution, Extortion and Espionage. They became OGPU, which is the main political administration, and later the MVD, as in Ministry of Interior Affairs. Later it was the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. After the Second World War, it was the Ministry of State Security, finally the Committee on State Security. Confusing, we could just say secret police. Anyway, sometimes there was one organization within the secret police which then overtook the whole thing, and who will spy on the spies? They're purging each other. So in the late 1920s, Stalin delivered a famous oration to the assembled Communist Party comrades, saying the USSR is 50 or 100 years behind the West. Either we make up this slack in 10 years or they crush us. It's one of the most celebrated quotations from Stalin. So he intended to drive his people very hard indeed, and he was a very cruel taskmaster to cram a century's work into a decade. So you can imagine there wouldn't be an awful lot of time for fun and games if that was the case. So the 5-year plan started in 1928, setting very high targets. Production things had to be greatly increased. Grain, maize, pork, beef, tractors, tanks, wildly overambitious. What they didn't seem to want to increase the production very much was consumer goods like clothes, shoes, toys, the good things of life. Things like cosmetics and jewellery were all but unobtainable. So farms were to be collectivized. One of the determinative factors in the Bolsheviks winning the Civil War had been land reform. They'd said, peasants, you've seized your land, you can keep it. Peasant proprietorship. A bit like the anarchist slogan, the land to him who works it. It doesn't matter who the paper owner is, whoever the legal owner is, if I am occupying it, I'm actually working on it, raising crops there, it's mine, you own it. That actually wasn't communism, because it's not owning it in common, it's not sharing it. So they had said the peasants were entitled to own land, but now they said the opposite. The smallholders were going to have their land taken away from them. So the communists were in a strong enough position to be able to wrest property from peasants who were going to hold on to it very tightly indeed. The peasants were forced into collective farms under the management of politically appointed managers, many of whom were urbanites who knew little about farming. They knew plenty about Marxism. So there were Sovkhodsky and Kholkhodsky, collective farms and state farms. So Sovkhoz was a farm where the labourers were paid a wage, whereas at Kholkhoz they worked for a share of the produce. The targets were almost impossibly high, so there was very little to spare left to them. The peasants, of course, greatly resented the loss of their property and their autonomy. So people tend to like being their own boss. collectivization brought back these memories of the very harsh requisitioning of the Civil War period, war communism. Peasants sometimes slaughtered their animals rather than hand them over to the state. Collectivization was not producing anything like the amount of food that Stalin thought. Stalin thought it would hugely increase yields, therefore it would free labor from the fields, more people would be able to work in mines and factories and so forth. He wanted to industrialize the country. So somebody had to be a scapegoat. Stalin certainly wasn't going to carry the can for this fiasco. It must be the kulaks. Kulak is literally a fist, and it's even a surname, Kulakov, although it was a rather unfortunate surname by the 1930s. This applied to the wealthier peasants. A rich peasant would count as affluent for something like owning a cow. They were denounced as evil money grabbers, exploiters, petit bourgeoisie capitalists. So communists paraded through streets with banners reading, "Liquidate the kulaks as a class." So to liquidate is to annihilate. Well, often involves killing them. If you're lucky, it could just involve a couple of decades in the gulag. So Stalin declared class war on the kulaks. They are arrested and sent by cattle truck to these distant penal colonies. So don't tell me that communists didn't believe in colonialism. They use the word colony about these slave settlements they set up for political prisoners. Just being born in the wrong socio-economic category was enough to have someone subjected to such cruelty. So punishing the kulaks was utterly unjust, but also extraordinarily stupid. They were the more hard-working and brainier peasants. They were the more skillful farmers. They were producing more. It was the worst thing he could have done. He should have been emulating what they were doing, not blaming them. So some people were not handing over all their grain to the state. One boy denounced his father for doing so. The father was then killed for it. The child was then exalted as a martyr for the collectivization movement. His deed was greatly publicized. I'm not sure that put people off reporting their parents for that, because there could be no posthumous reward. The communists were atheists. They disbelieved in the afterlife. So Stalin said that everything should triple production, and that included theatre. So not just evening performances, there had to be an afternoon and a morning performance, even if the theatre was virtually empty. So people were playing to an empty house. Viewers a rehearsal, I suppose. There was one farm labourer called Alexander Stakhanov, and he was hailed as a hero of socialist labour. He's claimed that he mined a phenomenal amount of coal in a single shift. He's said to have dug 14 times the target in 5 hours to 45 minutes. Now, many people say that is a physical impossibility, even for the strongest man in the world. He was actually helped by others. So yes, this amount of coal was dug, but by several people, not just by him. Nevertheless, his achievement was hailed as the most extraordinary accomplishment. It was announced with fanfare all over the state media. All media was run by the state. Newspapers, newsreels, and cinema. When he went to the cinema, and cinemas were spreading rapidly in the 1930s in the Soviet Union, people watched maybe a half an hour news bulletin before 2 or 3 hour film. So it was an all-evening event going to the cinema in those days. People were having snacks and beer and cigarettes in the cinema back then, because there was no television in the Soviet Union at that stage. Radio was very important, and more radios were being produced. People very seldom privately owned them. Only the privileged party officials would have their own radio. There were radios in restaurants and public places, things like that. So Stakhanov toured all over the Soviet Union, and he became an inspirational speaker to proletarians and harangued them to strive to increase their production output. So this original feat, well, if that wasn't enough, he was later claimed to have shifted 30 times his target in coal in a single shift. Obviously, a complete physical impossibility. Who was going to believe this pie in the sky? Anyway, it's like claiming that you ran 100 meters in 0.3 seconds. It's not going to happen, ever. Stakhanov was then lionized by the party, but many Soviet workers bitterly resented him because his example was putting impossible pressure on them to reach the most ridiculous targets. So that was that. The argument was, and the bosses was, well, if Stakhanov can do it, why can't you? You don't put your elbow into it, put your back into it. You're not trying hard enough. Stalin then strengthened the law for absenteeism. Missing work was punishable by imprisonment with hard labour, and they really meant hard. Absenteeism was defined as being more than 15 minutes late for work. So Stalin also was severely punished. So it was an extraordinarily cruel and unreasonable situation. One train driver was even sent to the Gulag for driving too slowly. So Stalin would brook no argument. Anyone who failed to meet his targets must be guilty of something. It couldn't be that the targets were wrong. This person must be willfully impoverishing the Soviet Union, must be an agent of foreign capitalists. Saboteurs were everywhere. They were always being unmasked. People confessed to sabotaging factories and so on behalf of the French, the Germans, the Americans, the British, the Japanese, whoever it was. It was always a plot. And those who were found guilty of sabotage were sentenced to slave labour if they were lucky, or death if they weren't. But death may have come as a release. So people were taken off by a cattle truck. So with no heating in the winter, very little food or water, no sanitary equipment, not washing for days, going deep into Siberia, Kazakhstan to work for starvation rations, and obviously no pay for years, with little or no medical care and really brutal conditions. They might be severely beaten up by the guards or other prisoners, some of whom were real vicious criminals, not just innocent victims. And if you got a sentence of, say, 10 years, not that many people survived it. So it really was a living hell. There was really just nothing to look forward to. I'm surprised people didn't lose the will to live. And they didn't do fair trials. If you were arrested, almost certainly that was it, that you were guilty. Even in more recent years, the conviction rate's been over 99%. So if you were given this one-way ticket to Siberia or Kazakhstan, the likelihood is you were not coming back. So American engineers were idealistic socialists, went to help the Soviet Union, and they were found guilty of sabotage too and spent years in the Gulag.